Welcome, everybody, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm an educator at the museum. And this afternoon, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Harry Davids, a Holocaust survivor, who will share his story with you. And afterwards, you will have the opportunity to ask him questions. Before we begin, I'd like to share a quick history of our museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure the world would always remember and learn from this tragic history. They did this at a time in the early 1960s when most people were not yet willing to speak about the Holocaust, largely because the public was by and large not yet ready to listen to it. But thanks to the courage and foresight of this group of survivors, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always with the mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. We can't do the work that we do today without our survivor community, who still on a regular basis shares their stories with us. Harry, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your story with the public and for helping us teach about this part of our history. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And Harry, you may begin when you're ready.
Thanks very much, Michael, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the presentation. We're going to start, before we start at the beginning, we're going to sort of start at the end. What I'm referring to is 1949. This was 4 years after World War II in Europe had ended. At that time, I was growing up in faraway South Africa. It was my first year at school. And one day, my parents shocked me by asking whether I was aware that they were not my real parents, that they were, in fact, my biological uncle and my aunt. And they asked whether I was aware that a year and a half earlier, at the age of 4.5, my uncle had brought me from Europe to South Africa to be adopted into the family. And that was because of my birth parents, along with many other family members, had been killed in Europe at the time of a big war that happened there. Did I recall any of that? And I was completely shocked. I had absolutely no recollection of that at all. And that conversation took place well over 70 years ago. I'm already approaching 80. And to this day, I still have no personal recollection of the experiences that I had in Europe at that time. So you may want to know, what are we all doing here? Well, I was very curious, as any child of that age would be. I wanted to know more. My new parents had not brought me into their bedroom to ask me that question. In order to answer questions, they wanted to find out how much I remembered and knew. And they didn't want to talk much else about it. In fact, in those days, very few people spoke about the events involving the genocide of Europe. In fact, the word Holocaust had not even been coined at the time that this conversation took place. As the years went by, I would receive certain tidbits of information along the way, but never enough to satisfy my curiosity. And the result has been a lifetime of research on and off. It was like filling out kind of a crossword puzzle without knowing what the picture looked like. Today, I have a pretty good idea what the picture looks like, but I'm still missing some pieces, and there may be even 1 or 2 pieces in the wrong place for all I know. But I'll try and share with you some of what I believe are the more important parts of the picture. And to help us do that, I'm going to first of all pull up my PowerPoint slides so that you can see what we're going to be talking about. My new mother in South Africa was born in South Africa, as were all her siblings. She came from a large family. So she had no contact at all with Europe. In fact, by that particular time, she had never set foot in Europe. So she didn't really know what was happening, except to the extent of the military war. There were, in reality, 2 different wars going on in Europe at the time of World War II. One is the war that everyone is familiar with. When we talk about World War II, well, we are talking generally about a war of military power and conquest, like so many other wars, fought mostly against other young armed people, headed by more senior people, in those days, mostly men. The genocidal war was a totally different war. That was a war waged mostly against civilians, totally unarmed, including women and children, with the intent of eradicating them. World War II, the military war, was fought for territorial possession. Nazi Germany believed that as the leaders of the so-called Aryan race, the master race, who had supposedly contributed more to the world in terms of the arts and the sciences than anyone else, should be entitled as of right to more living space. Lebensraum, they called it, because they felt that Germany was overcrowded. And the way they were going to obtain this Lebensraum was by invading countries inhabited by what they considered inferior people, such as the Slavic people who inhabited Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so on, and take those lands for themselves and have the people in those countries subservient to them. That was the basic idea. But the genocidal war was a war fought to get rid of people because of who they were. My birth mother was not aware of that part of the war. She came from a very large family, which included 4 brothers, 3 of whom were single at the time of World War II and had enlisted with the South African armed forces that joined the Allies fighting against Germany in different parts of Europe and in North Africa. Her youngest and closest brother had actually died in the fighting. He was a lieutenant in the artillery, and he had died when his jeep crossed over a landmine south of Florence in Italy, and he died of his wounds. And to her, like for so many other people, this was the war that really mattered, the military war. For virtually all her life, she looked upon people like me as being what we today call collateral damage of the military war. My new father had never mentioned the genocidal part of the war to her. She learned some bits and pieces about it, but she never fully understood what it was all about. But she wasn't alone. This was true of most people in those days. And even today, there are a lot of people who know nothing at all about the genocidal war, only about the war that affected our boys. My new father, on the other hand, knew a lot. He just didn't want to talk about it. He was, in fact, from Germany. He was my birth father's brother. There was another brother as well, a younger uncle. There were also 5 sisters. The youngest one died at the age of 13 in Germany and is buried there. And of the other 4, 2 were married before World War II began, and left Europe for other countries before things got bad. One went with her husband to Chile in South America. The other went with her husband to Palestine before it became Israel. The uncle who adopted me left Germany at the age of 20 at the height of the Great Depression. 30% of able-bodied adults in Germany were without work as a result of the Great Depression. It probably hit Germany harder than anywhere else because Germany had not yet fully recovered from the hyperinflation that they'd experienced in 1923, when the German government found itself forced to essentially just print money, excessive amounts of money, to pay the bills that they owed, especially the bills they owed for the reparations to countries like France and Belgium for all the damage that had been caused in World War I. So there was mass unemployment all over Germany. There was a family in Germany by the name of Stern, who were friends of our family in Germany, and they had relatives by the same name living in a small country town in Africa who owned a small wholesale business. And they were looking for someone just like my uncle, young, footloose, German-speaking, preferably Jewish, hardworking and honest. He checked all those boxes, and he accepted their invitation to come down there to South Africa and start a new life for himself. Several years later, he somehow managed to amass a little bit of savings, even during the Depression years, and was able to return via steerage to Germany to visit his parents. It would be the last time he would see them, although he never knew that. But he was also able to persuade his youngest brother to leave Europe as well and join him in South Africa and start a new life as well. He had just turned 17, had just completed his schooling there. So this meant that there were two uncles of mine and two aunts who were all living outside Europe in safe countries at the time of World War II and would therefore all be alive when the war ended. Their siblings would not be so lucky. My birth parents, along with many other members of the family, including all my grandparents, made a fatal mistake. They should have left Europe altogether. Instead, almost all of them migrated to the Netherlands, which at that time was considered a much safer country to live in and not as badly affected by the Great Depression as countries like Germany and some of the others. In the case of my birth parents, they had not yet met each other at the time that they left their native Germany for the Netherlands. Both of them had been offered work by relatives. My birth mother was offered work, along with her brother, as a matter of fact, who was also living in Germany at the time, at this place in Amsterdam, in downtown Amsterdam. The building still stands. It used to be called Hirsch & Company. It was the finest fashion department store in all of the Netherlands in its day. They went out of business back in 1976. In the year 2012, Apple moved in. And the slide you're looking at here features the opening day when Apple moved in to those premises, and they are still there to this day. So that's where she was, and that was the reason. Her cousins were running the business at that time. It had been started way back in the 1800s by her great uncle and great aunt. My birth father was offered work by his uncle, who had taken over from his uncle in this building over here. This is the interior. It was called Maison de Bonneterie. It was the second finest fashion department store in the Netherlands, and in competition with the business where my mother and her relatives were. And this business went out of business in 2014, and ever since then has been the home of the main flagship store of H&M in Amsterdam. So in Amsterdam was where the two of them would eventually meet and marry. We know that World War II began in 1939. And it was all about Poland initially, because, as I said earlier, the Nazi Germany wanted this extra living space for themselves, but they knew that they had to contend with the Soviet Union on the other side of Poland to the east, which also wanted part of Poland, especially for the raw materials on the eastern side. So Germany and the Soviet Union, shortly before the war began, made a secret pact. They would invade Poland together and divide Poland between them. And that's what happened. Germany went first on September the 1st, the Soviet Union, which really means Russia, on September the 17th, and that was more or less the end of Poland for now. The following year, 1940, Germany turns its attention to the west coast of Europe. What was that all about? Two main reasons. One was to guard against attacks against Germany coming in from the North Sea and from the Atlantic from the west. And another equally important, if not more important reason, was the attempt to conquer Great Britain. This was high up on Hitler's wish list. And the way to do that was to isolate Great Britain, which after all was an island. And the way you do that is by having control of the seas that surround Great Britain. So in April 1940, Germany invades Norway and Denmark. Sweden was neutral and remained neutral throughout the war. The following month, May 1940, Germany invades the Netherlands, Belgium, the northern and coastal parts of France, and tiny Luxembourg over here, which was done for strategic reasons. By June 1940, Paris fell. So now Germany is in control of the northern part of the west coast of Europe in accordance with its goals, and it puts down these huge fortifications, which became known as the Atlantic Wall, which would not be breached until D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy, France in June 1944 to liberate Europe. Later in the war, positions were taken along the coast by the Germans, where they put down these launching pads to launch the V-1 and V-2 rockets into Great Britain. So that is essentially the reason for the invasion of Western Europe by Germany. The Netherlands never expected the invasion. They didn't expect any involvement in this war at all. The Netherlands had been neutral in World War I. They had no ill will towards Germany. They were actually considered fellow Aryans by the Nazis. But they didn't understand Hitler's thinking, and they didn't understand his desire for European and later on possibly world domination. And they were sitting ducks. They had not participated in the First War. They had never upgraded their weaponry. Their forces were poorly trained. They had almost no army or no air force or navy to speak about. They were just no match for the Germans. On day 4 of the invasion, the port city of Rotterdam was bombed. The pilots had actually been instructed to focus only on the port area, but by accident they ended up, in addition, bombing large swaths of a residential part of old Rotterdam, leaving about 800 dead and tens of thousands homeless. But they used their error to warn the Dutch people, you can see what we're capable of. You clearly cannot defeat us. You need to surrender now, or we are simply going to continue the bombing. And for extra measure, they did drop a few additional bombs around some of the larger cities, even in Amsterdam, to make sure that the Dutch got the message. On that 4th day of the invasion, the royal family and the heads of the Dutch government fled into exile and would remain in exile until the war ended. On day 5 of the invasion, the armed forces of the Netherlands, such as they were, all surrendered. Germany then sent in from Germany into the Netherlands people experienced in government administration to oversee the government. They left in place in the Netherlands most of the civil service, but removed from the civil service all those that they found were not at least neutral, if not sympathetic towards them. And as far as Jews were concerned, they didn't want them in the civil service at all, and they were almost immediately all expelled. That even included the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, who happened to be a Jewish man. The Jewish population of the Netherlands was relatively small. The total population of the Netherlands was something just under 12 million at that time. The Jewish population made up less than 140,000. So it was actually quite a small population, and almost half of them, about 65,000, lived in the Amsterdam area. Nothing much terrible happened to them in the first year or two of the occupation. There were occasional outbursts of protests by young Jewish militants against the occupying Nazis. This happened several times, and when it did, the Germans rounded them up, several hundred at a time, and shipped them off to camps in Germany or Austria, like Buchenwald and especially Mauthausen, and most of them never returned. But as far as the rest of the population was concerned, the only thing that they had to worry about were the restrictions placed on their movements and on their being able to continue their professions and so on. These were measures that were placed on German and Austrian Jews as well before the Netherlands had been invaded, where, Jewish teachers could no longer teach Dutch children. Doctors could no longer renew their professional licenses. Means of transport were mostly shut off for Jews. If Jews wanted to do their shopping, they had to do it maybe at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon after the Aryan population had had their first bite of the apple and so on. Bicycles were later confiscated. Weaponry was all confiscated. Radios were confiscated and so on. But again, as far as any physical attacks on them were concerned, that at that point was still at a very low level. Everything changed in 1942. By that time, Nazi Germany had made a decision on how to get rid of whatever Jews still remained in all these more than 20 countries that Germany had occupied by that time. Most of the Jews of Europe were not in Western Europe at all. Countries like Poland and Ukraine had much larger populations than Germany. And in fact, by the time the war began in Germany in Europe in 1939, 60% of Germany and Austria's Jews had already fled because of an event called Kristallnacht, involving mass rampages against Jews in late 1938. But Poland had about 3.25 million Jews. Ukraine, the estimated Jewish population is somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million. Then you had Hungary, Romania with a very large population and so on. And in 1941, when Germany double-crossed the Soviet Union and marched its forces into the eastern part of Poland, driving the Russians out, and then continued marching into the Soviet Union itself, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, what was then called White Russia, the Ukraine, Georgia, all these territories, and eventually even Russia itself. That was Operation Barbarossa to capture the Soviet Union, and that started in mid-1941. And behind these forces came these Einsatz group and special task forces entrusted to get rid of the leaders of the Communist Party and also the Jews. And at least 1.5 million Jews alone were believed to have been killed in shooting operations in this part of the world. Their bodies were mostly thrown into pits. Some of the pits were later set on fire. But these were slow, they were expensive, they were messy, they were inefficient. And the Nazis were looking for something much more efficient, much faster, cheaper, to get rid of these Jewish populations in all these countries that they'd occupied. They came across a method which they'd hit upon earlier in a special program in Germany and Austria itself. And this involved very sickly people, mostly institutionalized mental patients, but also those very severely physically handicapped. The Nazi position on these people was that they made no contribution to German society, and they really were living a life that was not worth living. And what they would do is grant these people what they called a merciful death, what we would call euthanasia. They started off with young children and gradually progressed to adults and even older people later on as well. No one knows the exact number of people that they murdered. We know for a fact that more than 73,000 were killed based alone on German documents that survived the war, but many experts in the field believe that the number could have been as high as 250,000. Different methods were used to get rid of these sickly people. A lot of experiments were conducted, and eventually someone hit upon the idea of using carbon monoxide gas, and that became the method of choice in the later part of the program. They had tried to keep this secret. It eventually came out in public that some of the churches objected. The Germans, the Nazi government then attempted to sell this to the public as a kind of an economic issue. If we look at this poster, for example, we see here the translation roughly says that 60,000 German marks is what it costs to keep this chronically ill individual alive during his lifetime. Fellow countrymen, this is also your money. So they were trying to make an economic argument about that. The public really didn't buy it, and they continued to protest. So eventually the Nazis told everyone that they'd stop the program. In fact, they continued with this program in secret well into the war. But the experience that they'd gained from these gassing operations was now going to be transferred to special camps. And these camps were not in Germany. Most of them were in German-occupied Poland. And the purpose behind them was to get rid of the Jews, and these would be mass gassing operations. It first started with a camp on a farming area called Chelmno in Poland. And after a very successful, if you can call it that, operation there, the Nazis realized that they could now construct permanent gas chambers, and that's what they did in 5 camps, all in occupied Poland. Most of us are familiar with one of those camps, Camp number 2, also known as Birkenau, in the Auschwitz complex of camps. Then there was Majdanek, there was Belzec, there was Sobibor, and then there was Treblinka. Those were the 6 mass extermination camps that conducted gassing operations on an industrial scale. A small number of camps in Germany and in Austria also conducted gassing operations, but they were on nowhere near the scale of what we are talking about here in occupied Poland. We know, for example, that there was a gas chamber constructed in Dachau in Germany, but there's no evidence to show that it was ever used. In any case, this mass operation, which they call the final solution to the Jewish question, began in earnest in some countries as early as the spring of 1942. In the Netherlands, it began in the summer of 1942. And that very, very much affected our family. My birth mother at that time was pregnant with me in the 3rd trimester of her pregnancy. She could no longer hide her pregnancy. And when these roundups and raids by Germans came around to Jewish neighborhoods to take Jews away, began in the middle of July 1942, Nobody would take my parents into hiding. It was too dangerous because they could see she was pregnant. They were stuck with me until after I was born. The way that they conducted these operations was usually to go around to area by area, house to house, section by section, and this covered quite a few months. They didn't get round to us until much later in the year, and by then we weren't there anymore. In any case, we were living in an apartment. My birth parents had married in 1941, and they had taken over an apartment in this building in the residential part of Amsterdam, which happens to be 150 yards away from a similar building where Anne Frank and her family lived before they moved into hiding. However, there's no evidence that that my parents knew them in any way. They were from a different part of Germany, and Otto Frank, Anne's father, was about 10 years older than mine. But in this building, there were some relatives of ours who were living at the time. One of them was my father's cousin. She lived right across the hallway from us, and next door to her lived my mother's one aunt, a great aunt of mine. And those two ladies were offered a hiding place almost right away, but they asked if they could wait until a little later. They wanted to remain with my parents until to help them with my birth. But about 2 months after I was born, they were issued a warning by the people who had these hiding places for them. They said, look, we can't keep this place for you anymore. You need to come right away. Otherwise, we have to give your place to someone else. There are just too many people looking for hiding places. And so they had to leave. And my birth parents realized that as long as I was with them, we were stuck. We had to be separated in some way. My father found somebody through his work who knew someone in the Dutch resistance, and they made arrangements for me to be taken away from my parents when I was 2 months old to a house about a mile away that belonged to a family by the name of Den Os, not a non-Jewish family. They already had a daughter there, and in addition, they had a young Jewish woman who was staying with them in hiding already. So there were 4 of them, and when I came, that made 5. I was there for about 4 months. After 4 months, someone, probably a neighbor, betrayed us. The Germans came to the door to take us all away. But on the day they arrived, there were too many of us to fit into their car. On that particular day, the family was being paid a visit by their niece. So the Germans told the niece, you stay here in the house with this baby. When we come back, we expect you to both be here. Otherwise, there will be big trouble. They took the others away for interrogation and for eventual deportation in the case of the young Jewish woman. They were especially interested in the father because they suspected that he knew people high up in the Dutch resistance, and they were going to try and get whatever they could out of him. They beat him up really badly, left a big scar on his face, which remained with him for the rest of his life. He didn't say anything. They then sent him down to the south of the Netherlands to a work camp called Vught. They kept him there for 7 months, but he still wouldn't say anything, and eventually they gave up and released him. I should mention to you, and I mentioned some of this before, I had alluded to the fact that the Nazis considered the Dutch people fellow Aryans. For that reason, Dutch people were not treated quite as badly as people in, say, Poland or Czechoslovakia and elsewhere who were considered inferior. If they caught you hiding Jewish people, it usually meant death on the spot, either by shooting or hanging. In this case, you can see what they did, and this was typical. They would usually imprison you or perhaps send you to a work camp to try and re-educate you and get whatever information they could from you, but they wouldn't normally kill you. There was one circumstance under which they would in the Netherlands. If you took up armed resistance against them, if you were involved in sabotage or any other kind of military activity against them, and they caught you, that usually meant death by firing squad. In any case, I was then taken I was at that place when this happened. I was staying there, and the niece and I were in the house alone at the time that the German car left. We don't know what happened to the young Jewish woman. We heard that she was sent to Vught, but we don't know. That's that work camp in the Netherlands. We don't know what happened to her. She disappeared. The father, I already explained, had been sent to the camp. So the mother and the daughter were brought back together to the house. But when they came to the house, the Germans got a shock. They found the niece tied to a chair with rope, and I was gone. What had happened was one of the neighbors had noticed what was happening with us, and she had a connection with one of the top people in the resistance who lived nearby in Amsterdam, and she was able to contact him. And he and a young woman who was with the resistance quickly came on the other side of the street to watch what was going on. The car was still parked there. They knew about me. And then they noticed that I had not been brought into the car. They were wondering what was going on. After the car left, they came into the house and they found me there with the niece. They then tied up the niece, tied the niece up to with rope to a chair, and they told her, look, when the Germans come back, just be honest with them. You don't have to tell them any lies. Just tell them the truth. Just tell them that these people came in. There were two of them. You couldn't prevent them from taking the baby away and from tying you up. And in fact, that's what happened. When they came back, they did question her, but they realized that she knew nothing and there wasn't really much that she could have done about it, so they let her go. Meantime, my birth parents had tried to find hiding. We don't know to what extent initially they had been successful. What we do know was that in March 1943, which was about 3 months after we'd been separated, somebody offered them a hiding space in a small part of a barge. And this barge was supposedly going to go out into the canals to the north, where maybe they could find some hiding place. Somebody betrayed them. We never found out who it was. The Germans came for them. They tried to make a run for it. The Germans shot from behind. They caught my father on the lower shoulder, upper back area, and he went down. My mother didn't want to leave him, so she stopped running. The two of them were arrested and sent to this camp Destabark, which I will tell you about now. And from there, they were sent to a death camp. Destabark was the largest of all the camps, the German camps in occupied Netherlands. There were up to 107,000 people that had gone through that camp, which is more than half the population, the Jewish population of the Netherlands. Of that 107,000, almost 100,000 were shipped off either to Auschwitz-Birkenau to be gassed or to Sobibor to be gassed. Then there were also several thousand that were shipped to other camps like Buchenwald or Mauthausen or Sachsenhausen to perform slave labor. So there, those people had a chance to at least survive. Auschwitz and Sobibor, usually none, because by that time, the Germans weren't even looking for anyone to work there. Plenty of people in Poland and elsewhere that could help them. There were exceptions, especially if they could find somebody with special skills, then they would sometimes send you off to a camp. But in the case of Westerbork, it was really nothing more than a transit camp. They didn't usually keep you there for more than a few weeks, sometimes only a week, until they knew where they were going to send you. Trains left either for Auschwitz or Sobibor every Tuesday and arrived in one of those two camps late on a Friday afternoon, early Friday evening. In the case of Sobibor, this was a small, efficient camp, and the day you arrived there was the day you died. It was usually a matter of an hour and a half to maybe 2.5 hours at the most. We know that my birth parents had arrived in Sobibor, in Westerbork, the transit camp, on March the 23rd, 1943. We know that they were shipped out of there a week later on March the 30th, which was a Tuesday. And we know that they were shipped to Sobibor. And based on that 3-night scheduled trip, absent any other information or evidence, we can assume that they were murdered there on Friday, April the 3rd, 1943. How can I be so sure about those dates? Westerbork, as I said, was only a transit camp. It had no strategic or military value to the Germans nor to the Allies. The Germans had no reason to demolish the camp, which they did in the case of camps with really bad records, or, when I say records, I mean very bad histories, or in the case of camps that were gas chamber camps, they needed to destroy all of those. They tried to, they weren't completely successful. But in the case of a camp like Westerbork, there was no reason to destroy it. The Allies had no reason to bomb it because there was no ordnance there. There were no military installations, no weaponry there, no anti-aircraft guns, no soldiers. So everyone left the camp alone. When the camp was liberated by the Canadians in April 1945, they found there the records for all 107,000 Jews that had been brought in there, showing their full names, dates and places of birth, dates of arrival, dates of departure from the camp to their final destination camp, the name of the final destination camp, and the transport numbers. Before they left Europe after the war, the Canadians turned over all the documentation and the running of the camp to the Netherlands Red Cross. And to this day, the Red Cross still have all that documentation. And it was through that that I was able to determine what had happened, not only to my parents, but also my grandparents and many, many other relatives besides, who had made the fatal mistake of moving to the Netherlands and had been caught. I have here with me, for example, this document, which is the official certificate of the Dutch Red Cross. It's actually in German, the typewritten section. It's a certificate showing the name of my father, his date and place of birth, the address where we lived before, at the time that he was taken away, the date of arrival in Destabark, the date of departure from Destabark, the name of the final destination camp, Sobibor over here, and the given date of death of April the 2nd, 1943, because in the case of these gas chamber camps, nobody kept records. They only kept records and gave numbers. In the case of, well, as far as numbering was concerned, tattoos were not given except to people assigned to labor in the Auschwitz camps. But if you were assigned to death, there was no need for them to keep records of you, because your work was not going to be charged to any factory or anything like that, which was the case with these concentration camps where you had slave labor, because the factories employing slave labor did have to pay something to the government. And in order to have this whole thing done with controls, they had to keep track of their labor force. That was not required in the case of death camps. So therefore, the date of death is given only, it's an assumed date of death based on the schedule of these trains. So unless there's evidence to show that the train had been derailed or sabotaged or that people had escaped or something like that, which there was not, then it's a fair assumption that that's the date of death. And there are similar certificates for these other family members, which I was able to research. So this was an outstanding resource for me in being able to do my research. I should mention at this point that during the course of my research, I was able to locate the names of 76 members of my extended family that were living in Europe on the day I was born in the middle of the war in 1942. Of that number, I know of only 5 who survived. There were 2 people, my mother's 2 cousins, who had moved with their parents to Paris, France, well before the war. They totally disappeared off the map. Nobody knows what happened to them, but it's probably a safe bet that they were captured by the Germans and sent to be killed somewhere. We just don't know where, because they never showed up anywhere. They never acquired with anybody. Their names never appeared on any lists after the war. But that was the nature of the research you had to do. But I was very fortunate that I did have this resource, which was not available in most other camps. So the Netherlands was one of those rare exceptions where you were able, in most cases, to find out what had happened to your family if they'd been sent to Westerbork first. Okay. So that meant, of course, that I would never get to know my parents after being with them for only 2 months. The people who took me away from my first hiding family took me nearby to a building that was actually an annex of a local university where this young woman, who was one of the resistance fighters, worked. She actually had keys to the annex, and we stayed there the first night after I was taken away. The next morning early, I was taken by another woman. We're not sure which one it was. It was one of these 2 ladies over here who worked for this resistance group. Hetty Verhoeven, her name was, or Gisela Zernlein. Gisela was a law student at Utrecht University. Gisela was a student in something else. I think it was biology at one of the Amsterdam universities. And these 2 ladies would routinely take kids from one place to the other, Jewish kids, to be hidden. They were part of the largest of 4 groups that were organized during the war to help rescue Jewish children. These groups were dedicated to the rescue of Jewish children from the Nazis. The group that they were with, that I was taken by, was the largest of the 4 groups. It was called the Amsterdam Students Group. It was made up mostly of students. And you can see they were very young children, young people at that time, very, very idealistic. And from Utrecht, I was taken across the country to the north. Let me explain to you how that worked. This particular group, the Amsterdam Students Group, had made prior arrangements with non-Jewish people in 2 different parts of the Netherlands to hide Jewish people, Jewish children, as the occasion arose. And they had to make arrangements on their own to raise funds, to buy food, clothing, and that type of thing for them when they arrived. Most of them went down here to the south, to the province of Limburg, which was a predominantly Catholic part of the Netherlands. And the people who lived there certainly were Dutch people, but there had been a lot of intermarriage between the people in this province and people from Belgium and France further south. And so their complexion wasn't as light and as fair-skinned, and their hair often was darker than in most of the rest of the Netherlands, which was much more Germanic looking. They had no problems in taking in their young Jewish children who fit the stereotype of having darker hair, darker eyes, and so on. So most of the children were sent there. Ahead of time, a courier would go down there with a coded message, such as, prepare to receive a shipment of 45 cases or kilos of coffee. That meant that there were 45 dark-complexioned, dark-haired young Jewish children on their way. We're going to be coming down there and needed homes, needed food, and so on. Make sure you have all that prepared for them. Then you had a small minority of Jewish children who did not fit the appearance stereotype. I was one of them because I happened to be born with blonde hair and blue eyes, even though I came from a Jewish family. We were favored up in the north, in the province of Friesland. This Amsterdam students group had made prior arrangements with a number of liberal churches in the southern part of the province of Friesland to take children into hiding in their town, which was called Snake. And I was sent to a town, I was first sent to Snake, but after a few nights, according to what I was told, I'd been sent down further south from there to a small farming village called Stateless, in the hope that I would be able to stay there throughout the rest of the war. But what happened was, once again, I was betrayed, and so were many of the other children in some of the nearby villages. And the Germans had brought around a car, some kind of vehicle. Some people thought it was a van, others said it was a bus, to start picking up all these kids that had been betrayed. I was the first one because where I stayed was the most southerly of all these little villages in the province. Then they took me to the next house in the next village. And by that time, members of the resistance had found out what had happened. And some of them had somehow managed to trail the car. And when the car parked at the next place, and the Germans went into the house to collect the next child, they came to the car and they had to smash the doors open because they'd been locked. And they took me out and got me away before the Germans came back. And this time they had to take me far away because now people knew what I looked like. So they had to take me someplace else. And that was along the coastline, the western coast here of the northern part of the Netherlands in the province of Friesland. Apparently, I'd stayed with at least 2 families along the way. Why they were not able to keep me, we don't know. I've got no evidence that I'd been betrayed or anything, but I have a feeling that the real reason why I had to move was that I had become very ill. Because we know that by the end of the year, by December 1943, when I was about 14 months old, I had arrived in a small canal town called Dockham up here in the north, where I'm pointing the cursor. And the townsfolk there did not want to take me. They said that my body was covered in sores. I was wearing only underwear with a wet towel draped around me and shivering and totally disoriented. And they didn't think I had more than a week or 2 to live. And they were concerned about my skin condition. They didn't know what kind of disease I had, and they didn't want me passing that on to them or their families. They were even scared to hand me over to the doctors. Many of the doctors were actually members of the local Nazi party. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And in any case, the doctors in the Netherlands had instructions not to treat Jewish people. They had to turn you over to the Germans. And by that time, I'd been handed over to a member of a local resistance group. And now they had to scramble to see if they could find somebody in one of the small, farming towns or villages nearby that would take me while I was still breathing. I mentioned the Nazi party in the Netherlands. The Nazi party in the Netherlands was the largest Nazi party in Europe other than Germany. Most of us associate the Netherlands during the war with a country as being a country of rescuers. We all know the story of Anne Frank and the rescuers, Mep Gis and all the others. And it's true, the country was a country of rescuers, but that's only half the story. The other half is that it was also a country of collaborators and perpetrators. The Nazis had invited people to join the Nazi party in the Netherlands as fellow Aryans. They invited young Dutch men to join the Dutch SS in the Netherlands. It was a very, very successful campaign. About 23,000 young Dutch men actually joined. The poster says, it's a recruitment poster, says, Dutch men, for your honor and your conscience against Bolshevism. The Waffen-SS calls you. So this is an invitation to excitement. And it was a very, very successful campaign. So you can see there was a lot of collaboration. The train drivers and the personnel, the staff who were involved in shipping the Jews out to the German border by train were all Dutch people. Most of the people who handled the paper administration for the Nazis were Dutch people. So it's a very complicated story. Country of rescuers and a country of collaborators. In any case, nobody wanted to take me. And the local resistance group eventually found a man who lived in a small village called Invades, about 7 miles away to the east, in the hope that he and his family would take me. He was a member of the resistance himself. But he said that he had too many people in his house already in hiding with his wife and himself, but he would speak to his neighbors, the Bakker family. Maybe they would be prepared to do it. Up till now, they didn't want to do it because they had a large family and they were busy people. The Bakker family said, look, if there's nobody else who'll take them, we'll take them. This is a photograph of the Bakker family of Invades. I'm in the picture too on the lower right. You can see my hair was no longer blonde, it had turned light brown. And that's because this picture was taken 2 years after the war had ended. Excuse me, 2 years after I arrived there. It was taken about 6 months after the war ended. And to get an idea of the ages of the children, you want to subtract about 2 years from all these faces and the hair. So you can see it's a family of 6. The children were all at school. The young man, the boy, he was the youngest. He had just completed his first year at school. He was about to enter his 7th year on the planet. The eldest was Hilda here at the back, very tall young lady. She was a teenager. The father, Baron Bakker, was what you could call the local postmaster for the village. There was no real post office. It was actually part of our house with a couple of desks. But every morning during the week, he would go out on his bike with his mail satchel to deliver and pick up the mails. But his satchel contained things that didn't belong there, such as charts and maps showing the locations of the German military, propaganda and other books and magazines issued by the Dutch resistance, and occasionally even firearms like pistols and ammunition to dole out to his friends in the resistance. In the house, in the attic, they kept a large stash of Sten guns and rifles and ammunition. So he was actually a gun smuggler for the resistance, in addition to doing his regular work. Before I arrived, he and his wife had already helped place Jewish people in other parts nearby, but they didn't want to take anybody because of the fact that this was a large family, big family to feed, plus the fact that the father was busy, and actually so was the mother. She had opened up a small store right next to the home, selling these pots and pans to try and eke out some additional income during the tight war years. So they were busy people. And the original arrangement they made was that they would take me for only 4 weeks. And after the 4 weeks, when the school vacations were over, someone else had to take me. Well, it would turn out later that before those 4 weeks were up, they somehow took a liking to me and they decided to keep me just the same. But when I arrived, the first thing they had to do was find a doctor for me. There was no doctor in their village. There was a doctor in the neighboring village of Eyer, who was a friend of the Bakker family and also in the resistance. His name was Jarl Reiner. But he was only a family doctor, and he said he couldn't treat me when he saw me. This young fellow needs a specialist. And I will give you the name of a specialist I know. He's far away in the city of Groningen, in the nearby province of Groningen. And I think he's your best chance, because I don't know what will happen if the doctor opens him up and they see that he's Jewish. You've got a problem, or you may have a problem, but I think this doctor will be sympathetic. Bear in mind that in those days, it was only Jewish boys in Europe that were circumcised. It was obviously more dangerous, therefore, to hide Jewish boys than Jewish girls. And that was actually the reason why I ended up in Friesland, because of my complexion. The people of Friesland did not want Jewish boys there unless they looked like them. So that was the reason why I was sent there. In fact, they had a special word for us. They called us the tea. The ones that were sent to the south were called the coffee. So the tea kids were sent to the north, and the coffee kids were sent to the south. So the mother and the eldest daughter took me to the doctor in Groningen. There's a long story behind that. I don't think we have time to tell it to you right now. Maybe later if we have time. And The doctor treated me. They brought me back to the village. And within 10 days, I was ill all over again. At that time, the mother was doing something urgent, having to do with her business, and she couldn't leave. Fortunately, it was still during school vacations. So Hilda, the eldest, took me back to the doctor. And this time the doctor was able to treat me successfully. Now that I'm at the house, what are they going to do with me? Are they going to put me in their attic or their cellar? Well, the parents already had 4 children and had experience in raising 4 children. At some point, they were my age and they knew what happens when a child gets to that age. The child wants to move around, and if you don't let them move around, there's going to be a lot of noise. And they didn't want that. They had friends and relatives, neighbors in the house all the time. It's a big family, and they didn't want too much attention drawn to me. But they took a bit of a chance. They let me wander around the house in full view of everybody. And when the neighbors wanted to know who this young child was, they were given a story that this young child came from one of the big coastal cities. He had been very ill and he was recovering, and his parents were told, you need to send the child out into the countryside to get fresh air, to recuperate. But along the way in the countryside, he started getting more and more ill, and nobody wanted to keep him, and they kept moving him around. And now it's Christmas time, and we're very religious people. We can't let him die, even though we know that Jews are supposed to be our enemies. We can't let a young Jewish baby or any other baby die around Christmas time, especially. We'll take him, at least for now. So that was the story they gave, and so far so good. Winter comes and goes. Most of the spring has come and gone. Now German soldiers arrive in the village. What are they going to tell them? Are they going to tell them the same story that they're telling their neighbors? They decided no. They thought of a better plan. They knew that the Germans looked very much at appearances. So what they did was, when they let me play outside when it was a bit of sunshine or not too much rain, along with the other kids, to get fresh air and exercise. And if the Germans saw me there, who is this young blondie? Oh, that's our youngest child. That's our youngest brother. Hoping that the Germans would take one look at my appearance and move on. And that's exactly what happened. So this meant that there were now 2 stories going, one for the Germans and one for everyone else. Even that didn't last long. One day, the 2 youngest children in the house, in the family, came running into the house after school, telling the parents, all our friends at school are telling us that this Harry with us in the house is Jewish. You never said anything about that before. It can't be right. And the parents realized what had happened. And they told the children, look, it's true. Just don't make a big fuss about it. They never actually found out who it was who had spilled the beans about this. It was probably somebody in the resistance, because most of the people in the resistance knew about me, but they were supposed to be sworn to secrecy. But you know, it doesn't take much. All you need is somebody opening their mouths out of turn at the dinner table in front of the wife and the kids. And next thing you know, everybody in the village knows. So we don't know who it was, and nobody ever came forward after the war to admit. But they told the children, look, don't make a big deal out of it. But some of their neighbors were very upset. By then, the Germans already had a long reputation of going after innocent neighbors if you did something wrong. And they had been in the house regularly. Often their kids were in the house to play with the Bakr children. So there was a lot of anxiety. It got to a head at one point when one man, who was a Nazi sympathizer, his name, I don't remember the last name, but his first name was Seyer. Everyone in the village called him Seyer the Swine. He one day walked up to Baron Bakr in the street and said, I know that you have a Jewish child there with you in the house, and I'm going to report you. And Baron Bakr said to him, you say one word, you get a bullet between your eyes. And fortunately, Seyer the Swine never said anything to anybody. The middle of April 1945, the Canadians arrive in their tanks, and we are liberated. Several weeks later, word comes from Germany. Hitler is dead. Germany has surrendered. World War II in Europe is over. There was much celebrating. Canadian tanks in the area were going around inviting young kids to hop onto the tanks, and were doling out candies to them. I found out only a few years ago that the youngest daughter in the family over here, Rick was her name, she was invited to get onto the tank, and she took me with her. I wish I had the memory to remember what that day must have been like. There was so much rejoicing. Unfortunately, I was just too young to remember. The royal family, in the meantime, and the Dutch government heads who had gone into exile all returned from exile. And now the plan was to reform the government and get the country back to normal as soon as possible. To make that happen, they started passing all kinds of legislation. One law said that if you're harboring refugees in your home, we want to know about them. You need to send us whatever information you can so that we can compile lists with all this information so that these people can be reunited with their loved ones. We can get our country back to normal as soon as we can. That didn't happen right away. There were tens of thousands of people, many of them not Jewish, who had fled countries to the east, countries like Austria, Poland, and so on, who didn't necessarily want to be repatriated to their home countries, and they didn't want their names divulged. So it took a long time for these lists to be compiled. It took 7 months before my name came to anybody's attention that mattered. Remember those two ladies, those two relatives of ours who lived across the hall from where I was born? They were safely in hiding during the war. And after the war, they started peering through these lists in newspapers and magazines. And they came across this name, Harry, without a last name, because nobody knew my last name, without a date of birth, because when I arrived in the North, no one knew anything about me. I had no papers. In fact, I did not need papers in the Netherlands. And I don't know if this is true of the other countries that were occupied, but in the Netherlands, the Germans never asked for papers if you were under the age of 16. And that was a good thing in this case, because it meant that the resistance had no need to forge any documents for me. But at the same time, because there were no documents, nobody knew anything about me. They didn't even know my last name or my age. But these two relatives were wondering if this might be me. So they made arrangements to come and visit us. And they were able to identify me. They brought with them a small photograph of me in a cot at the age of 2 months, just before they went into hiding and just before I was separated from my parents. And in addition, I still had a small birthmark at the back of my neck, which they were able to identify. So they were able to positively identify me. They then returned to Amsterdam, and my father's cousin still had the addresses of her relatives, my uncles and aunts outside Europe. And she wrote to them, "Did you know that your family, that your brother had married during the war?" None of them was aware of that. Now she had to share with them that they did not survive. But now there was the more interesting news that there was a nephew alive in Europe who was going to come and claim him. This is actually a long story, but I'm going to have to make it short because of our time constraints. So the eldest of the two brothers who had gone to South Africa decided he was going to come forward and claim me for the family. By this time, he was living a much more settled life. He was already married with a young daughter of 2 years old when this news broke. But the timing was bad for him. His wife, my aunt, had just learned she was pregnant with a second child. She was having these morning sicknesses. And because of that, she wasn't able to help him anymore run the small business that he had. He had a store, clothing business and a textile business. He had a cashier that was helping him, but she had quit on him just 2 weeks earlier before the news broke that there was a nephew alive in Europe. And now his wife is now pregnant with a second child and she can't help out. So he had to now essentially hire a new cashier, almost like off the street, and take a chance with her and leave the keys to the business with her while he was absent to come and claim me in Europe. So he was under enormous pressure to get all this behind him as soon as possible, as you can imagine. And it didn't go quite the way he thought. He came over to our house by appointment. He told me about this when I was older, and so did my rescuing family. They were very nice to him. But then they said to him, "Look, we understand that you've lost many family members. We understand that you've come a long way to be here with your nephew. But you can see, look how he looks at us as upon us as his family. And as far as we're concerned, we are. You can't just uproot him away from a family, the only family he knows. We were also the ones who kept him alive from the beginning. We were the ones who made all his decisions for him and took all the risks. And we're not going to let you take him away." So my uncle had to return very disappointed back to Amsterdam without me, but then thought about it and decided he wasn't going to allow that to stand. He hired an attorney and started up a lawsuit for custody. He won the case by the skin of his teeth. I could tell you about the lawsuit in another half an hour, but we just don't have the time. But after he won the case, he thought it was a simple matter to put me on a plane with him, and we would fly together to Africa and get all this bad stuff in Europe behind us. Well, it didn't quite work that way either. He had just finished fighting my own rescuing family that he found himself fighting the Dutch government. They refused to give me a passport. What's the problem? Well, your nephew is not a Dutch citizen. How can he not be a Dutch citizen? He was born right here in Amsterdam. I have papers. Well, sir, we don't care where he was born. Our laws are not, obviously not the kind of laws that you have where you are. We don't care where you are born. That has nothing to do with citizenship. What matters is whether your parents were Dutch citizens at the time you were born. And it doesn't matter where you were born. It doesn't even matter where your parents were born. The question is, were your parents Dutch citizens when you were born? And the problem was that my birth parents had in fact applied for Dutch citizenship, but both of their applications were still pending. When Holland was invaded by Germany in May 1940, the applications were sitting on some bureaucrat's desk and never left there because that department was shut down after the Germans took over. My birth parents had been stripped of their German citizenship by the Nazi government in 1941. And so this meant that they were stateless at the time I was born. Under Dutch law, that meant that I too was stateless. There was only one plan B for my uncle. He had to sort of stand in line along with millions of others that were rootless all over Europe, either with no papers at all or with the wrong papers, living in the wrong country at the wrong time. And that was called a stateless alien passport. And that was the kind of passport that you had to wait in line for. You couldn't send in, $200 and you get it in 3 weeks' time. And that meant that he had to leave the country and wait for all the paperwork to come through many, many months later before he could come back and claim me for the family. That would only be in May 1947, more than 2 years after we were liberated. And what I've shared with you all up to this point are all the events in our family history of which I had to research and of which I have no personal memory. I don't even recall saying goodbye to my rescuing family. And yet, after my new parents told me at the age of 6 that I'd been brought there from Europe, several months later, I had a flashback of arriving in a plane and misbehaving and my ears bleeding. And my new father told me about that. He made a bit of a joke about it because in those days, everyone's ears bled on the flights because they were not pressurized. And I had a flashback of arriving in this new house with bright windows and sunshine that I was probably not accustomed to, having this huge Great Dane run towards me and meeting my new mother and my new sister. And of course, I recall growing up in the country. South Africa was the country of apartheid, or if we use the German and American pronunciation, apartheid. The word apartheid is an Afrikaans and Dutch word meaning segregation. That's what it means, segregation. South Africa was the most segregated country on earth. It was a country at that time that made up of about maybe 13%, maybe 12% people of European origin, which meant white-skinned, and most of the others were dark-skinned people, the people of Africa. It doesn't quite break out that way, but for our purposes, let's leave it like that. And the problem was that the whites had reserved for themselves all the power and all the best land. The theory of apartheid, which began the year after I arrived, which meant 1948, because that was the year the Afrikaner nationalists took power, the idea was that everyone all these ethnic groups had to develop in their own way in their own areas. So black people came from different tribal groups, had to live in their own ethnic tribal areas, the ancestral homelands, if you will. And that was where they could vote, and that's where they would have whatever rights the people there would give them. But they could not have those rights in the white areas. And even though whites made up less than 13% of the population, they controlled more than 80% of the land, and the best land at that. The whole program was doomed to failure. It was supposed to have been a case of, equal rights. In other words, it would be a separate but equal kind of arrangement. It never was. Starting with the inequitable distribution of the land, plus the fact that the majority of black people in South Africa did not live in these ancestral homelands. In fact, many of them were second, third, even fourth generation people who'd been living in these large townships that adjoined white areas where they were working for white people, and they weren't going anywhere. The problem then was that those who did so had no rights. So the whole program was doomed to failure at the beginning. It was a totally unfair arrangement. When I was 21 years of age, that was a key year for me. It was my final year in college in South Africa. I had just joined a new political party that was formed to persuade the white electorate to now open up the elections to everyone so that we could have much better representation of the population, to improve living conditions for all, educational opportunities, that type of thing. We never got very far. We were only able to elect into power one solitary member of parliament. She happened to be Jewish. Her name was Helen Suzman, but on her own, there was not much she could do. And as the years went by, things got worse and worse. The black population initially did not have much communication with the outside world, but with mass communications becoming much more widely available, they gradually began to realize, especially the younger generation, that other people around the world had rights that they lacked. And they began to protest so that they too could have their rights. And as time went by, the protests grew more and more violent. And when that happened, the South African police stepped in to quell the riots. They acted as a kind of an internal army when they weren't doing local police work. So to me and other family members and many other people living in South Africa, it was not a tolerable situation. And what we were going to do would be beyond our control. Many of us foresaw some kind of civil war or race war that we didn't want to be part of. And that was the main reason why I would eventually leave, along with other family members later in 1979. But I want to also point out that when I turned 21, it was a key year for me in another sense. My role had completely reversed. That was the year that I was now entitled to vote for the first time as a naturalized South African citizen. Even though I was not even born in the country, I now had all these wonderful rights and benefits that were denied to the vast majority of the population whose roots on the African continent go back longer than anyone knows. So it was a very ironic change of role for me. And I think I'm going to have to stop now and give you all an opportunity to ask whatever questions come to mind. I want to point out to you also that I did I did honor my rescuing family. I had the parents honored at Yad Vashem, the main museum in Jerusalem, Israel, in the so-called Garden of the Righteous. They were given a certificate of honor. The father, unfortunately, would not receive the honor. He had died a few years earlier at quite a young age. I would never get to know him, unfortunately. The mother, by that time, was already in a wheelchair. She was given this medal. The English inscription, the English translation of the Hebrew inscription says that whosoever saves one life is regarded as having saved the world in its entirety. It's a saying that's common to many religions, and that includes Judaism. And so that's that was my way of honoring, one way of honoring my rescuing family, the upstanders in my story, without whom I would not be here today. I was nothing more than a kind of a passive person, just looking on, you could say. I was like a lottery winner. These people were doing all the heavy lifting. So I invite you all to ask whatever questions come your way, and I'll try and do my best to answer them.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. If anybody has questions, those watching on Zoom can use the Q&A box, and those watching on Facebook can use the comments section, and we'll get through as many as possible. The first question is, did you ever experience anti-Semitism growing up in South Africa?
I experienced a minimal amount of anti-Semitism in the earlier years. And this is there's a strange story about this. I don't want to elaborate too much because of time constraints. In my earlier years, there were some young bullies in the class that would go after us minority Jewish kids that were there, and talk about us being dirty Jews and that type of thing. It wasn't of the kind that you had in Europe, nothing like that at all. It was much milder. And eventually it went away in a strange way and for a strange reason. The State of Israel was created in 1948. That was that was the year before I actually started school. And the South African government was looking for as many friends as it could, because many countries wanted to keep their distance from South Africa because of the new implementation of the apartheid policies. And South Africa was looking for friends wherever they could find it. And Israel was looking for friends wherever they could find it. And so Israel and South Africa, the diplomatic relations established by South Africa with Israel was among the very first of any diplomatic relations that was established with Israel. And the government was not happy about some of the anti-Semitism that was going around. There's a bit of a history behind that, because the Afrikaners that were in power, most of them, in fact, had favored Germany during World War II, even though South Africa was part of the British Commonwealth during the war and had provided troops against Hitler. And that goes back to the time of the Boer War, when their ancestors, the ancestors of the Afrikaners, had fought against the British and had imprisoned many of their children and women in concentration camps in South Africa, something which very few people know about. So there was a lot of bitterness. And you know the story, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And therefore, when World War II broke out, it wasn't that Germany was necessarily naturally aligned with South Africa, with the Afrikaner population, but Germany was an enemy of Great Britain. That's how it turned out. In any case, the idea was, toe down all this rhetoric against the Jews in the schools and elsewhere, and that's how it stopped. In fact, I should mention that Jews in South Africa were treated quite well. Quite a few Jews began to hold influential positions. One of my brothers-in-law, his father was a member of parliament for our town. And he was a very popular man, even with some of the Afrikaners.
Thank you. When did you start sharing your story?
That was in 2008, the year after I retired.
Have you had contact with your rescuing family?
Yes, and it took place in a way that you might not expect. Although there had been this bruising legal custody battle between my uncle and my rescuing family, at some point I was able to start writing to them, but initially not. They were the ones who initiated the contact. 3 months after I left the Netherlands for South Africa, they began writing to me, knowing full well that I couldn't read or write anything, let alone their language. The problem was that the parents usually wrote these letters and postcards, and they always signed them with some words like, I'll translate loosely, hugs from mother and father. And obviously my new parents didn't want me to see that. They didn't want me to be confused. And the result was that they trashed most of those letters. Later, though, when I began to read and write, and after they told me at the age of 6 what had happened, they began to sort of ease off a bit because they could see I was curious, and they allowed me to start writing to them. So we had this exchange of letters. It's actually quite a long, interesting story. And then after the parents passed away, I would start writing to some of the children. In more recent years, the correspondence, the communications have been with the great-grandchildren, especially one of the grandsons of this daughter here, the youngest of the 3 daughters, Rick. She died just a few years ago. One of her grandsons decided to put forth a book about how his ancestors had rescued me. I actually have the book here. It's in Dutch. And this book was launched at the end of April, early May this year. I made a trip to the Netherlands to be part of that book launching, and it was a very successful launching. So that was his way of honoring his family members. And of course, we're still in touch with each other. He made a trip here. In fact, he's been to the museum. I showed him around the museum because I used to be an active docent at the museum for a long time. And I took him and his brother came with him. I showed them around the museum, and they took photographs, and he wrote a whole spread in a newspaper in the Netherlands, which was a newspaper formed by the Dutch resistance during the war, as a matter of fact. And he is a news reporter for that newspaper. So it gained a lot of attention. In fact, a woman working for a publishing house in Amsterdam read the article and contacted him and suggested that he should write a book, and her firm would publish it, which is a very unusual thing. Usually you have to go cap in hand to your publisher to ask if they would take your book. Here you have the publisher coming to the writer.
Thank you. Do you know how your rescuing father passed away?
Yes, I think he had a heart attack of some kind. Yeah. He was in his 60s when he died. It was a bit of a shock to everyone because he had been a very active person.
Share with us what it was like being raised by your uncle, and your relationship with both your uncle and your aunt and their children.
Well, since you say children, I'll tell you about that. When I arrived, my new sister, who was really, of course, biologically my first cousin, she was only 2.5 years old. She has never remembered anything of my arrival. So to all intents and purposes, I've been her brother since day one. That's certainly true for my second sister, the one that my new mother was expecting at the time I arrived. She was born 3 months after I arrived. And a year after that, there was even one more sister. So I was present at the births of the 2 youngest sisters, And so we've had essentially a brother-sister relationship ever since. We've always considered ourselves just like siblings. We've had a very good relationship. The relationship with my parents is complicated. With my father, it was very good. With my mother, not quite as good, because I was a total stranger to her. I was no blood relative of hers at all. She was sort of taking a chance by accepting the adoption with my new father. She already had a daughter. She was already expecting a child when I arrived. So I arrived at a difficult time for her. And, you know, what do you do about a child that's not born to you when you've got 3 of your own children? You're perfectly capable of having your own children. So it was a rocky kind of relationship, but it was very hard for her. And when I got older, I had to begin to realize, and I did this on my own without anybody telling me, that I had to sort of think it through and realize she had probably gone through a harder time even than my new father, because she had to hold the fort while he was away, while she had just realized that she was pregnant. She had this young child to take care of. She couldn't help out in the business, sort of felt tied down to the house. At that time, she couldn't even drive a car yet. So, I think the burden on her was much harder. And as the years went by, though, she became much more mellow. She and my new father, to their credit, were the ones who suggested that I meet up, that I reunite with my rescuing family. And that was in the 1960s when I was in my mid-20s. And that's what I did.
What did you study in college?
That's a very good question. And before I answer that question, I should explain something to you all that you may not be aware of. Most countries don't have the luxury of having so many young people have access to a college education. In many cases, governments have to subsidize the universities. Very often you don't have any colleges at all. It's either a university or it's nothing. In South Africa, there were only a handful of universities. They were all subsidized by the government. The other part of the bargain was that if you wanted to go to college, yes, the government would subsidize part of your education, but in exchange, you needed to declare your major right at the beginning. You could not arrive in college without knowing what your major was going to be. That may seem very strange to young people here in the United States, where you're kind of used to that system. But in many countries, and South Africa was no exception, you had to do a degree, and usually had to be in furtherance of some kind of career that you had ahead of you. So I had already decided I was going to go into accounting. And so most of the subjects I took were related to accounting, but then you had to do some additional subjects. There were very few electives. That makes up the huge difference between the colleges in South Africa and those in the United States. Very, very few electives allowed. So the subjects that I studied were mostly accounting related and auditing related, having to do with the accounting profession. But there were some other courses that I could take in between. One of them, for example, was English. And at the college that I went to, you had to study English in your first year, no matter what you did. It was just part of their tradition. So I didn't have the kind of broad education that young people here in countries like the United States have, where you have access to all these elective courses. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you very much. To conclude, why do you share your story, and what would you like the audience today to take away from learning it?
A famous person from a long time ago once said that all that's necessary for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. The world is full of good people. At the time of these events, most good people did nothing to stop the bad things that were happening. There were all kinds of reasons for that. The genocide was going on under the cloak, under the darkness of World War II, which most people were much more interested in. So I can understand that. Yet there could have been more done. What about, for example, Rwanda? There was no world war going on during the time of the Rwandan genocide of 1995. There were plenty of good people around. The United States had over 2,000 troops stationed in Rwanda. When the word got out that there was a genocide brewing, instead of all these countries bringing in additional forces to prevent it, which they could have done, and that includes the United States, all the forces were withdrawn leaving the door open, and you ended up with the fastest genocide in history, 800,000 people slaughtered in 100 days, because there were so many good people out there who did nothing. When good people do nothing, you could just as well be aiding the enemy. That's why I make a point of making sure that this family's clip remains on the screen for as long as possible, to remind us who these people were, and the fact that unfortunately they were the exception. What was the exception should have been the rule. I would like to see more upstanders. And so I speak in the hope, it may be a forlorn hope, but I still speak in the hope that the world will see more upstanders in future, and hopefully prevent even more genocides, because the reality is that despite the many lessons that we've learned from the Holocaust, it's the most studied genocide in history. Despite that, genocides keep occurring, and according to some estimates, there have been more people who died in genocide since the Holocaust ended than in the 73 years or so up to and leading to and including the Holocaust, which is really, really a bad mark on our human species. So, let's think about what it means to be an upstander rather than a bystander.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, not just today, but all the times that you do this on such a regular basis. And you speak primarily to students. And I remember we had a student one time from Lincoln Middle School told you after your talk that you encouraged her to always be an upstander. And so we appreciate everything that you do for our community and our future generations by sharing this story and this message.
Good. Thanks so much, Michael. Thank you all, everyone, for attending. And let's think of what it means to be an upstander rather than a bystander. Thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you so much. And we encourage everyone to tune in every Thursday at 11 o'clock Pacific time for our public speaker. Next Thursday, we have Angelina Billauer, a survivor from Germany, who will share her story with you. Thank you so much, everybody, and we hope to see you next week. Have a good day, and thank you again, Harry.
Thank you, Michael.